The afternoon sun hammered Coyote Springs without mercy, turning the main street into a ribbon of pale dust that swirled with every gust. Inside Lying Lou's saloon, the air hung thick enough to chew tobacco smoke, layered with the sweet, sour stench of spilled whiskey and unwashed men who'd been drinking since noon. Liesl Vogel crouched at the battered, upright piano wedged into the corner, her calico dress patched so many times the original fabric was just a memory beneath the repairs. Red hair escaped its pins and damp spirals that clung to her neck. She'd been 22 for 3 months, but felt ancient, worn down by miles and grief and the particular exhaustion that comes from being alone in a world designed to crush women who had no one. Her fingers hovered above the yellowed keys, some missing entirely, leaving gaps, like a fighter's ruined smile. She could feel the men watching, waiting for her to fail. It was a game they played most afternoons when work was done, and cruelty was the only entertainment that didn't cost money. Look at her. A cowhand named Jessup crowed, elbowing the man beside him. Thinks those rags make her special. Thinks we want to hear her caterwauling. Ragged don't mean deaf, Liesl muttered, not looking up. Her accent carried the clipped precision of somewhere back east, somewhere cold and civilized, and utterly unlike this furnace of dust and casual violence. The laughter rolled louder, emboldened. Someone threw a peanut shell that bounced off her shoulder. Another made an exaggerated show of plugging his ears. The humiliation was familiar by now. She'd endured it every day for the 3 weeks since she'd stumbled into town with blistered feet and a packet pressed against her ribs that she guarded more carefully than breath itself. Lying Lou stepped forward, mustache waxed to knife points that caught the lamplight. He was 40 and soft in the middle, but dangerous in the ways that mattered a man who'd built his empire on weighted dice and information that he sold to the highest bidder. His real name was Louis Cartwright, but nobody called him that. The nickname stuck because it fit. He slammed the key cover down hard enough to make Liesl jerk her hands back. Not a note unless someone pays, he said, voice carrying the particular smugness of a man who enjoyed his power over small things. You want charity, try the church. A theatrical pause. Oh wait, we ain't got one. The room erupted in laughter that had teeth in it. Liesl straightened slowly, ignoring the way her knees protested she'd slept on straw behind the livery again, curled around the packet she never let go, and her body was keeping score of every indignity. The door opened. Wind came first, a hot gust that set the oil lamps guttering and sent playing cards skittering off tables like startled birds. Then the man appeared, silhouetted against the brutal afternoon glare. He was tall, 6 feet easily, with shoulders that spoke of hard work and harder living. Buckskin shirt fringed at the sleeves, decorated with intricate beadwork across the chest, in geometric patterns of blue and white and ochre. His hair fell straight and black past his shoulders, and tucked into his beaded headband was a single feather, white-tipped, that caught the light as he moved. Mape. Some called him White Feather, though rarely where he could hear it. His face was unreadable, carved from the same stone as the mountains, visible through the doorway behind him. The quality of sound in the room changed. Men who'd been laughing now watched with the wary stillness of predators encountering something unfamiliar. Hands drifted toward gun belts with practiced casualness that fooled no one. Mahpi crossed to the piano in 5 measured strides, his moccasins silent on boards that creaked under everyone else's weight. From somewhere in his clothing, he produced a silver coin, real silver, not the lead slugs some tried to pass, and placed it on the piano's closed lid with a soft clink that seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly tense space. Let her play. His voice was low, carrying no threat on its surface, which somehow made it more threatening. The English was perfect, better than half the white men in the room could manage, shaped by years at the territorial school before he'd walked away when the teacher came at him with shears. Lou's face cycled through several shades of red. Now look here, you can't just... I paid. Moppy didn't raise his voice or move his hand toward the knife at his belt, but something in his stillness communicated volumes. She plays. The room bristled like a dog's hackles rising. Liesl felt it crackling in the air, violence deciding whether to stay leashed or slip free. Her heart hammered against the packet beneath her dress, the papers inside suddenly feeling like they weighed 100 pounds and screamed their presence to everyone looking. She drew a breath that tasted of fear and tobacco, and drew the key cover up herself, slowly giving the room time to settle into this new reality. Her fingers found the ivory tentative, at first picking out a hesitant waltz her mother had taught her when the world still made sense. The melody was simple, almost childlike, and for a few bars the room seemed to relax slightly, as if this was what they'd expected, something pretty and harmless from a ragged girl trying to earn a meal. Then Liesl let something shift inside her, all the rage and grief and stubborn refusal to break that had carried her across half a continent, and the music changed. The waltz transformed into something harder, a marching rhythm that built like thunder rolling across open plains, like hoofbeats on sun-baked earth, like every ounce of defiance she'd been swallowing for weeks, finally given voice through hammered wire and weathered wood. One by one, the men fell quiet. The music filled hollow places that whiskey had carved in them, reminded them of things they'd left behind, or lost, or never had. Mothers, wives, parlors with lace curtains instead of this cave of smoke and sin. Liesl's hands moved faster, more certain pulling from the decrepit piano sounds it had probably never made and might never make again. Then steel flashed in the dimness. The shot came from near the bar, a drover named Calhoun, whose trigger finger was considerably faster than his thinking. The candle perched on the piano's top exploded in a spray of hot wax and twisted wick. Tallow spattered across Liesl's wrist, burning. She gasped and jerked back, the music dying in a discord of struck keys and her own sharp cry of pain. Mahpe moved. He crossed the space between himself and Calhoun before the man could thumb back the hammer for a second shot. There was no wasted motion, just efficient violence honed by necessity. Mahpe's shoulder drove into Calhoun's chest, lifting him off his feet and slamming him backward into the brass spittoon with a crash that sent brown liquid sloshing across already filthy floorboards. The revolver clattered away, spinning under a table. Mahpe straightened, slowly turning to face the room with the kind of calm that was more frightening than rage. When he spoke, his voice was flat and steady as a judge reading sentence. "Next fool hurts the pianist, he'll play the Undertaker's tune." Silence took the room for real then. Not the held-breath silence of violence postponed, but something deeper, the hush that comes when men realize they've pushed against a line they didn't know existed, and found it made of something considerably harder than they'd expected. Even Lou went still, suddenly very interested in polishing a glass that was already clean. Liesl's hands shook as she lowered them to her lap. The wax was already cooling on her wrist in white rivulets that stung where they'd burned. Through the ringing in her ears, the gunshot had been close, too close. She heard her own heartbeat, and beneath it, the scrape of a chair, as someone decided sitting was safer than standing. Mahpe didn't look at her. He simply picked up his silver coin from where it had fallen during the confrontation, placed it deliberately back on the piano lid, and walked to a corner table where shadows pooled thick and watching would be easier. Outside, the wind kept blowing. Inside, someone coughed nervously. Cards began to shuffle again, the sound tentative at first, then finding rhythm. The saloon remembered how to breathe. But nothing was quite the same as before. Liesl wrapped her burned wrist in her apron, the only clean fabric she owned, and stared at the coin, gleaming in the lamplight. Real silver worth more than she'd seen in weeks. Worth more than the insult it had bought, or the song, or even the moment of safety. Worth perhaps the beginning of something she didn't yet have words for. Liesl Vogel had been born in a narrow house on Mulberry Street in St. Louis. where her father kept ledgers for the merchant's bank, and her mother took in sewing until consumption took her instead. That was 6 years back when Liesel was 16 and still believed the world operated on principles of fairness and hard work rewarded. Her father, Heinrich Vogel, a meticulous man who dotted his I's with precision and never missed church, had taught her piano using a widow's instrument 3 doors down, paying in bread and company rather than coin they didn't have. Liesel showed aptitude. Not genius, but competence and feeling, which was enough to dream of teaching someday, perhaps marrying the butcher's son Wilhelm, who smiled at her after Sunday services. A small life. A safe life, the kind measured in seasons and predictable milestones. Then her father found the plates. Not the actual engraving plates used for printing currency. Those were locked in vaults controlled by men whose names appeared in newspapers and whose hands stayed pristine. But Heinrich found evidence of them: charcoal rubbings made with tissue-thin paper pressed against counterfeit plates, inventoried and sealed under chain of custody, capturing every scrollwork detail and serial number. He found a ledger page too torn from a larger book, documenting payments and shipments that connected St. Louis bankers to territorial land offices to fraud that stretched halfway across a continent. Someone was printing false currency and using it to buy land from desperate homesteaders for pennies on the dollar and then reselling to the railroad at 50 times the price. The operation was vast, organized, and utterly ruthless. Heinrich Vogel was a man of principles. He wrapped the evidence documented under chain of custody in sheet music, hiding it in plain sight, and prepared to take it to the federal, the U.S. Deputy Marshal. He made it 3 blocks from the bank. Liesel had been at the cemetery arranging wildflowers on her mother's grave, the kind gesture that cost nothing but time, when a boy found her. Your father, he'd gasped blood on his hands from trying to help, down by the docks. He said, "Hide the music." By the time she reached Mulberry Street, constables were already searching their rooms. She'd grabbed the packet her father had hidden under loose floorboards, sheet music, wrapped in oiled paper, innocuous, unless you looked closer, and run. The stage west left at dawn. She traded her mother's wedding ring for passage, climbed aboard with nothing but the clothes on her back and the packet pressed against her ribs, and didn't look back, because looking back meant seeing her father's blood still staining cobblestones, and she couldn't bear it. The holdup happened 3 days later on a lonely stretch of road where rocks clustered close and escape was impossible. Bandits took cash and jewelry roughed up. The men ignored Liesel beyond taking her small purse. They didn't search her, didn't find the packet. She'd walked the final 20 miles into Coyote Springs with feet that bled through shoes that disintegrated around them. Arrived with blisters and dust and a determination that felt less like courage and more like having no alternative left to imagine. The town was one of those territorial settlements existing in the gap between law and wilderness, a place where marshals appeared twice yearly if you were lucky, and most disputes were settled with fists or lead rather than warrants. The main street held a saloon, general store, livery land office, and telegraph depot that connected them tenuously to civilization. Buildings leaned slightly as if tired. Boardwalks had gaps that could catch a heel. Everything wore the same sun-bleached gray. Liesel played piano for meals when Lou was amenable and someone was paying. The rest of the time, she slept behind the livery Nora Caldwell, the freight hauler they called Widowmaker. For reasons nobody explained, clearly let her use the stable in exchange for occasional washing, and kept the packet so close she could feel its corners with every breath. Mahpe she learned about in pieces from fragments of other people's conversations. His full name was Mahpia Ska White Cloud, though he'd shortened it years ago when white tongues kept mangling the pronunciation. He was Lakota, his people having ranged these territories for generations before treaties that were really just theft with legal language. He'd attended the territorial school for 3 years, unusual enough to mark him as different, even before considering his heritage learning English and mathematics and geography, Before walking out the day, the teacher came at his hair with shears spouting something about civilization and assimilation. Some said he'd killed a man in Angel's Crossing 2 years back. Others said the man had killed himself after Mape beat him fairly in a horse race, and Shame did what the race hadn't. The truth was probably somewhere between, but truth mattered less than reputation in a place like this. What everyone agreed on. Mahape kept to himself, spoke when necessary and not before, and moved through the territory like smoke, present one moment, gone the next, impossible to pin down or predict. He ran mail, sometimes carried messages for the few ranchers still holding on despite drought that had turned grass to memory. He appeared when you needed him and vanished when you didn't, and people had learned not to ask too many questions about either. And he was searching for someone. His younger cousin Dasan, the name meant leader. Though the boy was barely 20 and led nothing but ore wagons, had vanished 6 weeks prior, while hauling samples for the new assay office, which issued a receipt and ledger entry in Timber Fork, a mining camp 2 days' ride north through country that could kill you in a dozen different ways. Dasan had left on a Tuesday with 5 crates of rock samples and a promise to be back by Sunday. He'd never arrived at Timber Fork, never returned to Coyote Springs, just vanished like water into sand, leaving nothing but questions and the particular grief that comes from not knowing. Mape had tracked as far as Dragonfly Creek before the trail went cold. Literally cold, washed away by a flash flood that redrew the landscape overnight. Now he lingered in Coyote Springs like a wolf waiting for rabbits to forget his presence and move carelessly. He suspected the saloon was connected somehow to whatever had taken Dasan. Suspected but couldn't prove, and suspicion without proof was just another form of helplessness. There were other characters in Coyote Springs who'd become important later, though none of them knew it yet, while living their small dramas against the larger backdrop. Dr. Ambrose Kingsley, 55, and worn down to bare essentials by life and laudanum and the weight of poor decisions. He'd studied medicine back east, or so he claimed, and his hands were steady enough that people believed it before a fondness for opiates brought him west, where standards were lower and questions fewer. He'd stopped the drugs 2 years back, quit cold after watching a child die while his hands shook too badly to set a broken bone properly. The debts remained, though accumulating interest both financial and moral. And he stitched wounds for free more often than not, because some part of him was still trying to balance accounts that would never quite settle. Ida Harrington taught school in a one-room building at town's edge, 50 years old, with a spine straighter than the lodgepole pines in the mountains and a tongue sharp enough to cut glass. She'd come west after her husband drowned, fording a river in Colorado, one of those stupid deaths that happened when men got impatient with nature's timing. She owned 2 dresses, one for summer, one for winter, both mended past recognition, and kept a kerosene lamp burning in the schoolhouse window every evening. So children, and occasionally adults, could come sound out words after their chores were done. She believed in education the way some believed in salvation, with the fervor of someone who'd seen ignorance kill as surely as bullets. Gideon Moss ran, or attempted to run a homestead 5 miles out, 45 years old and hollow-eyed from work that never ended, and hope that kept not quite dying. He'd filed his claim 3 years back with dreams of raising cattle, of building something permanent in a place where permanence was just optimism wearing overalls. The drought had other plans. His wife had taken the children back to her people in Kansas the previous spring, and he couldn't blame her, though the loneliness sat in his chest like a stone. Still, he watered strangers' horses at his trough, even when his own cattle bawled from thirst, because some part of him needed to believe the world was a place where small kindnesses mattered, where decency counted for something against the grinding machinery of circumstance. And then there were the others, the ones who made kindness necessary because they trafficked in its opposite. Sheriff Horatio Pike wore a badge that caught lamplight prettily, and kept a ledger in his vest pocket where he noted payments with the careful penmanship of someone who'd been educated just enough to be dangerous. 40-years-old mustache waxed to fine points he'd been appointed by the territorial governor after the last sheriff disappeared, some said to California. Others said to a shallow grave, and Pike himself said nothing at all. He understood that law in a place like Coyote Springs was less about justice and more about managing chaos in ways that benefited certain parties, himself prominently included. Fierce Frederick Bascom, though nobody used his full name, was Pike's enforcer, and Lou's sometime employee, a Wyoming drover, whose face bore a scar from temple to jaw where a knife had opened him up during a dispute over cards. He was 35 and brutal in the casual way of men who discovered violence came naturally and decided to make a career of it. These were the pieces on the board when Liesl Vogel stumbled into town with evidence documented under chain of custody wrapped in sheet music, and Mape lingered like a question waiting to be answered. After the saloon confrontation, after the gunshot and the silver coin and the music that had briefly made the room remember it was populated by humans rather than animals. Night came down hard and fast, the way it did in open country. The sun dropped behind the mountains, and within 20 minutes, full dark had settled, stars emerging in their thousands, like holes punched in black fabric with light bleeding through. Liesl slipped out the saloon's back door while Lou was distracted by a poker game that was probably crooked and definitely loud. She intended to return to her nest behind the livery, to wrap herself in the thin blanket Nora had given her and try to sleep despite hunger and fear and the burn on her wrist that throbbed with each heartbeat. A hand caught her elbow. She spun, gasping, free hand already moving toward the packet beneath her dress in an instinct that was becoming automatic. Found herself facing Mape, who stood close enough that she could see his face in the starlight filtering down. He released her immediately, hands up in a gesture of peace. Didn't mean to spook you. You succeeded anyway. Her voice came out more breathless than she'd wanted, betraying the fear that lived just under her skin these days. He studied her with dark eyes that seemed to catch what little light there was. Up close, she could see details the saloon shadows had hidden: a thin scar bisecting his left eyebrow, a silver hoop in one ear that caught starlight the way his mouth was set in a line that suggested he smiled rarely and meant it even less often. You keep that close, he said, nodding toward her dress where the packet made a slight bulge against her ribs. Her hand went to it automatically, protective. Like you keep that, she shot back, gesturing to his headband with its white-tipped feather. His mouth moved in what might have been a smile or might have been a grimace. Fair enough. They stood in the alley, really just a gap between buildings, where water pooled when it rained and chickens scratched when it didn't, and something passed between them. Not attraction exactly, more like recognition. The way two people who'd both survived different storms might nod to each other, acknowledging shared knowledge of lightning. Thank you, Liesl said finally, because someone needed to say something, and the silence was growing uncomfortable. For earlier, in there. Didn't do it for thanks. Why did you do it? He considered this, looking past her toward where the mountains were just darker shapes against the dark sky. Tired of watching men act like animals. That must be exhausting in a place like this. Now he did smile, brief as summer lightning. You have no idea. He walked her to the livery, not touching, but close enough that anyone watching would think twice before approaching. At the door, she paused, hand on the weathered wood. Will they come after you for what you did to Calhoun? Probably, but not tonight. They'll let it settle first, see if I leave on my own. Will you? Not yet. His eyes moved past her again, scanning the street with the automatic wariness of someone who'd learned to watch his surroundings or die. still looking for something. She wanted to ask a dozen questions about who he was, and why he'd helped, and what he was searching for. But exhaustion was pulling at her bones like gravity, and some questions were meant to be answered in their own time. She slipped inside the livery into darkness that smelled of hay and horses and the particular sweetness of straw bedding. Outside, she heard his footsteps fade toward wherever he slept. She didn't know where, realized suddenly that there was a lot about him she didn't know. The packet pressed against her ribs, keeping its secrets. She unwrapped it carefully, in the darkness, running her fingers over the papers inside, to reassure herself they were still there, still intact. The charcoal rubbings felt slightly waxy under her fingertips. The ledger page crinkled softly, her father's handwriting precise even in the margins where he'd noted dates and amounts. Hide the music, he'd said with his last breath. She'd hidden it, carried it 1,500 miles. Now she just had to figure out what to do with it. How to get evidence documented under chain of custody from the hands of a ragged pianist into the hands of someone who could actually do something about corruption that stretched from St. Louis to the territories. A problem for tomorrow. Tonight she was too tired to solve anything. She wrapped herself in Nora's blanket wool, scratchy but warm enough, and curled on the straw with the packet clutched to her chest. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of gunshots and silver coins, and a man with a white-tipped feather who'd bought her the right to play one song in a room full of men who'd wanted her silent. She woke twice once to the sound of horses passing fast, hooves drumming urgency into the night, and once to what might have been a scream or might have been a coyote, she couldn't tell. Both times she clutched the packet tighter, feeling the stiffness of paper and the weight of responsibility it contained. Morning would bring other things. But that was still hours away in a future that felt both inevitable and impossible to imagine. The telegraph arrived just after dawn, when light was still gray and uncertain, and the town was just beginning to shake off sleep like a drunk surfacing from a bender. Liesl woke to Nora's voice, calling her name rough with something that might have been urgency or might have been fear. And the two sounded similar before coffee. She scrambled out of the straw dress, twisted and hair wild, and found Nora in the livery doorway. The older woman's face was tight in a way that made Liesl's stomach clench. "Something's stirring," Nora said without preamble. "Saw young Tobias heading to Pike's office before sunup. That boy doesn't move fast unless there's fire or money involved, and I don't smell smoke." Liesl's hand went automatically to the packet. "What kind of something?" "The kind that involves folks scurrying like rats before a barn cat shows up. If I were you, girl, I'd make myself scarce today. Maybe take a walk way out toward Gideon's place, stay out there till sundown." But curiosity, or maybe the need to know what fresh disaster was rolling toward her, pulled Liesl out into the morning, despite better judgment. She ducked behind the water trough when she saw Tobias emerging from the sheriff's office, the young man's nervous energy visible even from a distance. He was barely 20, all elbows and ink-stained fingers with wire-rimmed spectacles. He pushed up his nose compulsively, even when they hadn't slipped. She waited until he'd gone practically running back toward the telegraph depot, then crept closer to Pike's office. The window was open a crack, Pike's concession to the stuffiness that built up in the small room overnight. She pressed herself against the sun-warmed wood and listened. Pike's voice drifted out talking to someone. Lou, she realized after a moment. The saloon owner's oily tones were distinctive, like rancid butter-given speech. "Shipment arrives dawn." Pike was saying, paper rustling. "Plates enclosed. Keep the girl quiet." Liesl's blood turned to ice water in her veins. "The redhead?" Lou asked. "What's she to do with anything? She's just some waif who wandered in half dead." "Not sure yet. Message came from our associates in St. Louis. They're tracking someone who fled after that bank clerk got himself killed last month. Young woman, red hair, might be carrying documents. Description matches. And if she is trouble? A pause that stretched long enough for Liesel's heartbeat to fill it 3 times over. Then Pike, flat and cold as winter stone. We'll handle it same way we handled the Indian's cousin. Quiet, clean, accident that nobody questions. The Indian's cousin. Dasan. They were talking about Dasan. Liesel's hands shook. The packet against her ribs suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, like it was screaming its presence to anyone who looked. She backed away from the window, moving as quietly as terror would allow, and nearly collided with a stack of empty crates behind the depot. She had to find Mape, had to warn him, had to a hand clamped over her mouth. She tried to scream, but the hand was firm, and then a voice, Mape's voice, whispered directly into her ear. Don't. Pike's man is watching the street. Come with me. Now. He released her mouth, and she spun to find him crouched beside her face, grim. He jerked his head toward the alley behind the buildings, and she followed without question, instinct overriding thought. They moved fast through the gaps between structures, using morning shadows and the town's preoccupation with breakfast to cover their movement. Mape led her to the livery's back entrance through the door and into the relative safety of enclosed space. They know. Liesel gasped out as soon as they stopped moving. Pike got a telegraph. They know I'm here, know I might have something. They mentioned your cousin Dasan, said they handled him quiet. The words tumbled over each other in her haste to get them out. Mape's face went still in a way that was somehow more frightening than rage would have been. Show me, he said quietly. Show me what you're carrying that's worth killing over. She glanced around. The livery was empty this early, everyone still at breakfast, and with fingers that trembled slightly, she untied the packet. The oiled paper crinkled as she unwrapped it, revealing sheets of music scored in her mother's careful hand. But between the staves, pressed against the paper like pressed flowers, were other things. Charcoal rubbings, thin as whispers, detailed as memory. The intricate scrollwork of engraving plates, the kind used for printing currency. And tucked among them, a torn page from a ledger, entries recorded in her father's cramped handwriting. Names, dates, dollar amounts, connections between St. Louis bankers and territorial land offices, between legitimate business and the kind that required bodies buried in shallow graves and questions never asked. Mape studied the papers without touching them, his eyes moving over the details with an intelligence that Liesel suspected people often underestimated because they saw his heritage before they saw him. Your father stole these, he said finally. Not a question. He found them. The men running the counterfeit operation were buying land with false bills, squeezing out homesteaders during the drought, then reselling to the railroad at 10-20 times what they paid. Massive fraud. He was going to take it to the federal, the U.S. deputy marshal. Her voice cracked slightly. They killed him before he could, 3 blocks from the bank, bled out on cobblestones while people stepped around him like he was an inconvenience. And you ran. What else was I supposed to do, stay and die too? The words came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with the helpless fury that had been building since that day. No. He looked at her, then really looked, and something in his expression softened. You did right. But if Pike knows you're here, knows you're connected to that bank clerk's death. He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. A sound outside boot heels on hard-packed earth, moving with purpose. They both froze. Through the gap in the wall boards, Liesel saw Fred approaching with another man beside him, both armed, both scanning the street with the alertness of hunters. In here, Fred was saying. Lou wants the place checked. Girl's been sleeping here. Maybe she left something useful. Mape moved fast. He caught Liesel's wrist, not hard, but firm enough to communicate urgency, and pulled her deeper into the livery toward the back, where a loose board in the rear wall let daylight through in a thin line. She clutched the papers to her chest, trying to rewrap them with shaking hands while moving. The front door creaked open. "Anyone here?" Fred called his voice, carrying the lazy menace of a man who enjoyed his work and was good at it. Mape pressed a finger to his lips, then pointed to the gap in the wall. Liesel understood immediately. She squeezed through easier for her than it would be for him small mercies, and emerged in the weedy space behind the building where chickens scratched and the privy stood crooked against the morning sky. A moment later, Mape followed his broader frame, scraping against the wood hard enough to leave splinters in his shirt. They crouched low, listening to Fred and his companion moving through the livery, overturning buckets, kicking through straw, searching with the thoroughness of men who'd be punished if they came back empty-handed. "Nothing," the other man said, finally, disappointment clear in his tone. "Maybe she already ran." "Maybe." Fred didn't sound convinced. "Or maybe she heard us coming and ducked out the back. Check the street. I'll look behind." Liesel's eyes went wide. Mape grabbed her hand and ran, pulling her toward the scrub brush beyond the town's edge. They sprinted across open ground that offered no cover, betting everything on speed, and dove into the sage just as Fred emerged from between buildings. "There!" Fred's shout split the morning. "Behind the livery, they're running." Liesel didn't look back. She focused on running, on keeping her feet under her despite the uneven ground and the dress that tangled around her legs. Beside her, Mape ran with the easy lope of someone who'd spent his life moving through country like this. But he kept pace with her rather than outrunning. And she realized with a strange detachment that he was matching his speed to hers, staying close in case she fell. A rifle shot cracked the air. The bullet hit a rock 3 feet to Liesel's left, spraying chips that stung her cheek like angry wasps. She cried out, couldn't help it, the surprise and pain overriding control, and Mape shoved her down behind a deadfall cottonwood, its trunk gray and weathered as old bone. "Stay low," he ordered, already pulling his rifle. A Henry repeater, brass-framed and well-maintained from where it hung across his back. He sighted along the barrel-tracking movement in the distance. Another shot. This one punched through a sage bush just behind them, close enough that Liesel heard the bullet's passage like fabric tearing. Mape fired once, not at Fred, but near him, a warning shot that kicked dust near the man's boots. "Can't win a war here," he said, more to himself than her. Too exposed. He was right. The terrain offered minimal cover, scattered brush, and the occasional rock outcrop. If they stayed pinned, Fred's reinforcements would flank them or wait them out, and neither option ended with them breathing. "Can you run?" Mape asked, eyes still on the distance. Liesel's feet were already blistering. She'd traded her last real shoes for stage passage, and had been wearing makeshift moccasins Nora helped her cobble together from scrap leather. Her dress would catch on every thorn. But none of that mattered, because staying meant dying. "Yes." "Then run. Stay low. Head for those cottonwoods. There's a creek. We can use the water to lose them." They broke from cover together, sprinting toward the line of trees that marked Dragonfly Creek. The world narrowed to breath and motion, and the slap of her makeshift shoes against hard earth. More shots, one close enough that she felt the air pressure change as the bullet passed another that kicked dirt across her boots. Then they were at the creek, splashing into water that ran cold and shallow over smooth stones. Mape pulled her downstream, using the low bank for cover boots, soaking through. The water was maybe a foot deep here, not enough to hide them, but enough to make them harder targets and wash away their tracks. They moved fast, part running, part wading, part stumbling for what felt like miles, but was probably less than one. Finally, Mape pulled her up onto the far bank and into a thicket of willows that grew dense and tangled, nature's own hiding place. They collapsed there, breathing hard water streaming from their clothes. Liesl checked the packet first the oiled paper had held. The rubbings were damp but intact, and the ledger page slightly smeared at one edge, but still legible. Small victories. "You all right?" Mape asked between breaths. She did a quick inventory, no blood besides what was trickling from the rock chips that had peppered her cheek, no holes in her that shouldn't be there. Just water and mud and terror that was already settling into the kind of exhaustion that comes after adrenaline drains. "I think so." He nodded, leaning back against a willow trunk. His eyes were closed, but his hand stayed on the rifle, ready. "We need help," he said after his breathing had settled. "Can't do this alone, run forever, hide forever. We need to get that evidence documented under chain of custody to someone who can actually use it. Who would help us? Everyone in Coyote Springs is either on Pike's payroll or too scared to cross him." He opened his eyes, considering. Not everyone. Gideon owes nobody, nothing, lost too much already to care about losing more. And Ida, the school teacher, she's got more spine than sense. If we can reach them, maybe. Gideon's place is 5 miles out. Then we walk 5 miles. Better than dying here. They rested another 10 minutes. Both of them knew it was dangerous to stay still, but both also knew that moving while exhausted was a good way to make fatal mistakes. Liesl wrung what water she could from her dress. Mape checked his rifle, making sure water hadn't fouled the action. Neither spoke much. There wasn't much to say that the morning hadn't already screamed at them. When they finally moved, heading cross-country toward Gideon's homestead, the sun had climbed higher and was starting to bake the moisture out of the air. It was going to be a brutal day. Liesl could tell the kind where heat became a weapon and distance became an enemy. They kept to low ground where possible, using every scrap of cover the land provided. Once they froze as a rider passed on the road, half a mile distant, too far to tell if it was Fred or someone innocent, but close enough to remind them that hunters were looking. It took 4 hours to cover 5 miles. By the time they stumbled into sight of Gideon's homestead, a sad collection of buildings huddled around a windmill that turned lazily in the breeze. Liesl was limping badly, and Mape's jaw was set in a line that suggested he was managing pain he wasn't mentioning. Gideon saw them coming from where he was stringing barbed wire along a fence line work that looked both endless and futile given the drought. He dropped his tools immediately, hand moving toward the shotgun leaning against a post. Then recognition crossed his weathered face. "Mapa." He approached cautiously, taking in their appearance, soaked, muddy, clearly running from something. "What in blazes happened?" "Need a favor, Gideon," Mape said without preamble. "A place to hide, maybe an hour, maybe more. Pike's men are hunting us." The homesteader's eyes narrowed. "What did you do?" "Nothing. But the girl here has evidence documented under chain of custody of fraud that reaches back to St. Louis. Pike's connected to it somehow. He knows she's here, and he's planning to make us disappear same way." He stopped, jaw working. "Same way others have disappeared." Gideon looked between them, weighing options that probably all seemed terrible. Then he made a decision that likely saved their lives. "Root cellar. Now, if anyone comes asking, I'll tell them you went north toward Timber Fork. Go." He led them at a near run to his root cellar, a hole in the ground, with wooden steps leading down into darkness and the smell of earth. He lifted the heavy angled door and gestured them inside. Liesl descended first, feeling her way downstairs, slick with condensation into air that smelled of potatoes and old soil and safety. Mape followed, rifle still in hand. Above them, Gideon looked down, his face partially shadowed. "There's water in the jug down there. Some dried meat. Don't make noise, these doors are thick, but sound carries strange underground. I'll come get you when it's clear." The hatch dropped closed with a thud that cut off daylight, like a knife plunging them into absolute darkness. For a long moment they simply stood there, letting their eyes adjust to nothing, because there was nothing to adjust to. Liesel's heart was still hammering from the run. Her feet throbbed, the scratches on her cheek burned, but she was alive, which was more than she'd expected an hour ago. A match flared Mape, lighting a stub of candle he'd produced from somewhere in his clothing. Weak yellow light revealed a space about 6 feet square, walls lined with rough-cut timber sacks of potatoes stacked against one side. A jug of water sat on an overturned crate. Some strips of dried beef hung from a nail. "Sit," Mape said, gesturing to the packed earth floor. "Save your strength. We don't know how long we'll be down here." Liesel sat, drawing her knees up and wrapping her arms around them. The packet pressed against her ribs, familiar now as her own heartbeat. She should feel relieved, she thought. They'd escaped. They were safe, at least temporarily. Instead, she felt the weight of what Pike had said settling over her like a shroud. Same way we handled the Indian's cousin. "They killed Dasan," she said quietly. "Because of this." She held up the packet, suddenly hating it, hating the paper and ink that had cost her father and Mape's cousin their lives. "Because my father found these plates, because I ran instead of—" "Don't." Mape's voice was sharp enough to cut. "Don't finish that sentence. You ran because staying meant dying, and dying meant that evidence documented under chain of custody disappears, and your father died for nothing. You did right. You're doing right. What happened to Dasan?" His voice caught. "That's on them, the men who killed him, not you. We don't know for certain they killed him." "Yes, we do." He said it flatly, no room for doubt. 6 weeks ago, he left for Timber Fork with ore samples. Never arrived. No body, no horse, no answers. And now Pike says they handled someone quiet. He shook his head. "We know." They fell silent. The candle burned lower. Above them faintly came the sound of a wagon approaching. Voices. Boot heels on wooden planks, someone walking across the porch above the cellar. "Open it, farmer." Fred's voice unmistakable, even muffled by earth and timber. Liesel's breath stopped. Beside her, Mape had gone completely still, barely breathing, every muscle tensed. "Open what?" Gideon playing confused. "Don't play stupid with me, Moss. We tracked them here. Saw footprints leading right to your door. You're hiding them, and you're going to give them up, or I'm going to burn this place down around your ears. Folks pass through all the time." Gideon said, his voice carrying the patient exhaustion of a man who'd explained obvious things to idiots more times than he could count. "I water their horses, they move on. That's hospitality, not conspiracy. Christian charity, if you want to put a name to it." A different voice now, Pike himself. "We can do this easy or hard, Moss. Your choice. But one way or another, we're searching this property. You can cooperate or you can watch it burn. Nothing here but potatoes and prayers, Sheriff. But if you want to waste your time looking, be my guest." The sound of boots on floorboards, objects being moved, overturned, a knife being drawn. Liesel heard the distinctive slide of steel against leather. Then something heavy rolled across the floor above them. One of the potato sacks probably being slashed open. Tubers hitting wood with soft thuds. The cellar hatch creaked. Light flooded down the stairs in a golden rectangle that fell just short of where they crouched against the far wall. Liesel pressed back, knowing it was futile, knowing they were caught. But Mape moved slightly, positioning himself between her and the opening, and she realized he was preparing to fight. To die fighting, probably because there was no way 2 people in a hole could win against men with guns and light and time. A shadow blocked the light. Pike's voice floated down. "What's down there, Moss?" "I told you. Potatoes, turnips, onions, root vegetables. You want to come count them, Sheriff, you're welcome to climb down and check my inventory personally." A long pause. Liesl could feel Pike's suspicion like a physical thing pressing down through the darkness. Her hand found Mahpe's in the darkness, gripped it hard. He squeezed back once, then released her to keep his rifle hand free. "Actually," Pike said slowly, "I think I will have a look." Liesl's heart stopped. This was it. This was Sheriff. Fred's voice calling from a distance. "Got something out by the barn. Looks like fresh horse tracks heading north." Another pause. Then Pike, irritated. "How fresh?" "Can't be more than an hour. 2 sets moving fast." Pike swore. "They doubled back while we were checking the house. Fred, take 3 men and follow those tracks. I want them found by sundown, understood?" "Yes, sir." "As for you, Moss." Pike's attention returned to the cellar. "If I find out you lied to me, if I find out you helped them, I'll burn this place with you inside it. Clear? Crystal, Sheriff?" Gideon's voice was flat empty of everything except exhaustion. The light shifted as Pike moved away from the opening. The hatch slammed closed with a bang that somehow felt worse than if he'd discovered them. Footsteps retreated, horses being mounted, the creak of leather and jingle of tack. Then silence. They waited in the darkness. Mahpe had extinguished the candle the moment light had appeared for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes. Finally, the hatch creaked open again, and Gideon's voice came down rough with relief. "They're gone. Headed north toward Timber Fork, following some tracks I laid earlier with my workhorse. It'll buy you a few hours, maybe more if you're lucky." They climbed out into afternoon light that seemed impossibly bright after the cellar's darkness. Liesl's legs shook as she emerged. Mahpe kept a steadying hand on her elbow until she'd found her balance. Gideon's face was grim blood trickling from a cut above his eye, where someone, probably Fred, had hit him. "You two have stepped in something deep," he said without preamble. Pike's scared, and scared men are dangerous. What exactly are you carrying that's got him so spooked? Mahpe looked at Liesl, who nodded. She pulled out the packet and explained quickly the counterfeiting her father's murder, the evidence documented under chain of custody connecting St. Louis bankers to territorial fraud. Gideon listened with the focused attention of a man who'd learned that details mattered. "You need the U.S. Deputy Marshal," he said, when she'd finished. "The one in Blue Mountain. He's honest, one of the few. But it's 3 days' hard ride from here, and Pike will have men watching the roads." "Then we go around," Mahpe said. "Cross country. It'll take longer, but—" "You won't make it." Gideon shook his head. "Not with Fred hunting and Pike organizing a proper search. You need to get a message out first. Telegraph the U.S. Deputy Marshal, let him know what's coming, maybe get him to meet you halfway." "Tobias would have to send it," Liesl said. "The telegraph operator. And he's—" She paused, thinking about the nervous young man who'd run to Pike with the morning's message. "He's scared. I don't know if he'd help." "Then you convince him," Gideon said flatly. "Because it's the only play you've got." They waited until full dark, not just twilight, but true darkness, when the moon hadn't yet risen and the stars were the only light. Gideon provided them with food he couldn't really spare, dried beef hardtack, a canteen of water. He also gave them information Fred had taken men north toward Timber Fork, but Pike had stayed in Coyote Springs with at least 3 others. The telegraph depot would be watched, but maybe not as carefully as other places, since Pike wouldn't expect them to come back into town. The journey back to Coyote Springs took 2 hours, moving carefully through darkness. They approached from the east, using the dry creek bed that ran behind the buildings on the north side of the street. The town was quieter than usual. Windows mostly dark, only a few lamps burning in the saloon and sheriff's office. They found Tobias in the telegraph depot working late on what looked like routine messages. Moppy knocked on the back door, 3 soft taps, a pause, 2 more taps. A pattern that might mean something or might just be random. But it sounded deliberate enough that when Tobias opened the door, a crack, he didn't immediately slam it again. His eyes went wide behind his spectacles when he saw them. "Saints preserve us," he breathed, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "You two, everyone's looking for you. Pike's got a reward posted. $50 for information leading to your capture. We need your help," Liesel said quickly before he could close the door. "1 telegraph, that's all." "To who?" "Federal, the U.S. Deputy Marshal in Blue Mountain. It's urgent." Tobias's face cycled through several expressions: fear, curiosity, fear again. "I can't. If Pike finds out, he already knows about the counterfeiting operation." Moppe interrupted quietly. "He's part of it. Question is whether you're part of it too, or whether you're just a scared kid who reads other people's messages and keeps his head down." The young man flinched. "I'm not part of anything. I just send what people pay me to send." "Then help us send one more message," Liesel pressed. "Evidence documented under chain of custody of fraud reaching from St. Louis to here. Counterfeit plates inventoried and sealed under chain of custody being used to buy land illegally. Your name can stay out of it. We'll say we broke in, forced you, but we need that wire sent." Tobias looked between them, weighing options that probably all seemed terrible. Finally, he stepped back, opening the door wider. "Make it fast. Lou usually stops by around 7 to check for messages, and it's 6:30 now." They slipped inside. The depot was small, cramped, dominated by the telegraph key and its associated equipment. Tobias sat at his desk, fingers hovering over the key. "What's the message?" Liesel had been composing it in her head for hours. She kept it brief, knowing that long messages increase the chance of interception or error. "Urgent. Counterfeit plates inventoried and sealed under chain of custody en route Coyote Springs. Evidence documented under chain of custody in hands of witness. Request immediate assistance." That's all. "Add this." She pulled out the ledger page, pointed to the bank seal stamped in the corner, a complex mark combining a shield and an eagle. "Send this symbol too in Morse. The U.S. Deputy Marshal will recognize it as coming from St. Louis Merchants Bank. It'll tell him this is legitimate." Tobias's fingers began to move, tapping out the message in the rapid staccato of practiced Morse. The sound was like rain on a tin roof, rhythmic and strangely soothing despite the tension coiled in Liesel's chest. She kept glancing at the door, certain that any second Pike or Lou or Fred would burst through, and that would be the end of everything. The key went silent. "Done," Tobias said, pulling his hands back like the equipment might burn him. "Now get out before—" The window exploded inward in a spray of glass and splintered frame. Liesel threw up her arms, instinctively felt shards slice her forearm in a dozen places. Blood welled hot and fast, dripping onto the floor. Through the broken window, Fred appeared, pistol drawn, his scarred face split in a grin that had nothing human in it. "Well now," he said, voice carrying genuine pleasure. "Isn't this cozy? The little pianist, the Indian, and our helpful telegraph operator all in one place. Makes my job easier." Moppe moved before Fred finished speaking. He grabbed the desk and shoved it hard, slamming it into the window frame and catching Fred's gun hand. The pistol went off the shot, going wild, punching a hole in the ceiling that rained plaster dust down like dirty snow. "Go!" Moppe shouted at Liesel and Tobias. He pointed to a hatch in the floor, the baggage drop where luggage and freight were lowered to the storage space beneath the platform. Liesl didn't hesitate. She dove for the hatch, pulled it open with hands slippery with her own blood, and dropped through into the cramped space below. Tobias followed, landing hard beside her. Then Mapi, who slammed the hatch closed just as another shot rang out above them, the bullet chewing splinters from the floorboards, inches from where the hatch had been. They crawled through the narrow space on hands and knees, the dirt floor damp and smelling of mildew. Above them, boot heels thundered. Fred's voice cursing creatively. More shots punching through floorboards, but missing them as they crawled toward where daylight showed through gaps in the platform's far end. They emerged behind a stack of crates marked with shipping labels blinking in the late afternoon light. Behind them, Fred was still in the depot shouting for backup. They had maybe 30 seconds before the whole town descended. Then salvation arrived in the form of Ida Harrington. The schoolteacher appeared from the alley carrying a bucket that sloshed with what smelled like kerosene. She saw them, didn't miss a beat, and dumped the bucket in the middle of the street between the depot and the saloon. Then she pulled a match, one of the new phosphorus matches that lit with a scratch, and dropped it into the spreading puddle. Flames whooshed up, not dangerously hot, more spectacle than substance, but enough to draw attention and create confusion. Men came running from the saloon, from the general store, some with buckets already in hand, because fire was every frontier town's nightmare. Fire! Ida shouted, her voice carrying the authority of 2 decades spent making children pay attention. The depot's on fire. Someone help. It was a lie. Only the street was burning, and even that would burn out in minutes, but it worked. Men grabbed buckets, forming a chain to the water trough. Fred burst out of the depot, saw the chaos, swore again, and started shouting orders that nobody was listening to. In the confusion, Mapi pulled Liesl and Tobias into the shadows behind the general store. They ran through the maze of back alleys and gaps between buildings, finally emerging at the livery, where Nora was already harnessing horses, 2 of them saddled and ready. "Figured you'd need these," she said without preamble. "Gideon sent word you were coming back. Fool thing to do, coming back into town, but I suppose fools and heroes look similar from a distance." "We had to get a message out," Liesl said, clutching her bleeding arm. "Did you?" "Yes." "Then get out of here before Pike organizes a proper search. Go east toward Stone Creek, then cut north. Harder country, but less watched." They mounted Mapi, pulling Liesl up behind him on one horse, since she'd never learned to ride properly, Tobias taking the other. Then they were moving horses, breaking into a gallop that carried them out of Coyote Springs and into the open country beyond. Behind them, shouts and confusion. Ahead, mountains purple in the gathering dusk and a sky that stretched forever. They rode hard for an hour, until the horses were lathered and blowing, and Liesl's arms ached from holding on. Finally, Mape reined in at a dry wash, where rocks provided cover, and they could rest without being visible from a distance. Tobias slid off his horse legs, shaking. "I can't go further," he said, voice tight. "I'll head back, tell them you forced me at gunpoint. Might save my job, might not, but I can't just disappear." "They'll know you helped," Mape warned. "Maybe. But they can't prove it if I stick to my story. You 2 get that evidence documented under chain of custody to the U.S. Deputy Marshal. Make this worth something." He rode back the way they'd come, a small figure growing smaller against the darkening sky. Liesl watched him go and felt a pang of guilt. Another person pulled into her disaster, another life disrupted by evidence documented under chain of custody her father had died for. Mapi checked her arm in the fading light. The cuts weren't deep, but they were numerous, bleeding steadily. He pulled a strip of cloth from his shirt, the cotton one beneath the buckskin, and wrapped her arm with careful precision, his fingers gentle despite their roughness. "Hold still." he murmured, breath warm against her wrist as he worked. She did, watching his face in profile, the concentration in his dark eyes, the set of his jaw, the way his hair fell forward over his shoulder. They were close enough that she could feel his body heat in the cooling evening air, close enough that when he tied off the bandage, their hands touched and neither pulled away immediately. "Thank you," she said quietly. He looked up, met her eyes. For a moment, something passed between them. Not quite a spark, but more than friendship, something that might become more if they survived long enough. Then he cleared his throat and leaned back, putting distance between them. "We should keep moving. Put more miles between us and town before we stop for the night." They rode on into darkness, the horse's hoofbeats a steady rhythm that matched Liesel's heartbeat. Her arm throbbed where the glass had cut her, but the pain was manageable, just another item on the long list of discomforts she was learning to carry. The night was clear stars, emerging in their thousands as the last light faded from the western sky. Somewhere behind them, Coyote Springs was probably still in chaos, Pike organizing a search, Luce calculating losses, Fred nursing his anger and planning revenge. Ahead lay uncertainty and danger, and the slim hope that the U.S. Deputy Marshal would receive their message and actually do something about it. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. So they rode into the darkness, two people bound together by evidence documented under chain of custody and necessity, and something else that neither was quite ready to name and trusted that morning would bring answers instead of bullets. They made camp in the ruins of an old line shack around midnight, when exhaustion had become dangerous and pushing further would mean falling off the horse or making fatal mistakes. The shack was little more than 3 walls and a partial roof abandoned by some homesteader who'd given up and gone back east. But it provided minimal shelter from the wind that had picked up with nightfall. Mahapi built a tiny fire in what had once been a fireplace, using dead wood that would produce minimal smoke. Liesel sat with her back against the least damaged wall, wrapping herself in the single blanket they'd taken from Gideon's place. Her arm throbbed steadily. The cuts were already starting to scab, but movement kept reopening them. "Let me check that," Mapi said, settling beside her with a small tin he'd produced from his gear. He unwrapped the makeshift bandage, carefully examining the wounds in the firelight. Most were shallow, just surface cuts from flying glass. One was deeper, about 2 inches long, across her forearm, still seeping blood. He opened the tin, some kind of salve that smelled of pine and something astringent, and applied it with gentle fingers before rewrapping the wound with fresh cloth torn from his dwindling supply of spare clothing. "You're running out of shirts," Liesel observed, trying for lightness despite fatigue. A small smile touched his mouth. "I'll get more. After. After we're dead, or after we testify. Whichever comes first." She laughed. She couldn't help it, the absurd humor of their situation, breaking through exhaustion. Here they were running for their lives through hostile territory, carrying evidence documented under chain of custody that could topple corrupt officials, and they were making jokes about clothing. Mapi finished tying off the bandage, but didn't immediately pull away. His hand lingered on her wrist thumb, resting against the pulse point there. She felt him counting her heartbeat, or maybe his own, or maybe just marking time in a moment that felt suspended between crisis and calm. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for all of this. You didn't have to help me. You didn't even know me. I know you now." He said it simply as fact rather than sentiment. "Why did you help? Really, it wasn't just about those men in the saloon." He was quiet for a long moment, eyes on the fire rather than her face. When he spoke, his voice carried weight. "My cousin Dasan." He started, then stopped. Started again. He believed in things. Fairness, justice, rules that applied to everyone. He thought the world could be better if people just tried harder. A pause. When I saw those men mocking you in the saloon just for existing, for trying to earn your way. If I'd let that pass, I'd be proving Dasan wrong. Proving the world is just animals, and the strong eat the weak, and nothing matters. That's a heavy reason to buy a piano song. Heavy times make heavy reasons. Liesl turned her hand over, letting her fingers curl around his. A simple gesture connection, acknowledgement, two people in the dark holding on. My father used to say that civilization was just people agreeing not to be animals for a few hours at a time. Sounds like he was an optimist. He was. Look where it got him. Mapi's fingers tightened slightly on hers. It got him a daughter brave enough to run 1,500 miles with evidence documented under chain of custody that could change things. That's not nothing. They sat like that while the fire burned lower, casting dancing shadows on the ruined walls. The wind outside carried the smell of sage and distant rain that might finally come. Somewhere, a coyote called high and lonesome, and another answered from a different direction. What happens tomorrow? Liesl asked finally. We ride for Timber Fork. It's a mining camp about 2 days north Rough Place. But there's an assay office which issued a receipt and ledger entry there. Dr. Kingsley, who recorded injuries and treatments in his ledger, works there sometimes, and he's honest. Maybe he knows something about Dasan, about what happened. And if he doesn't, then we keep going to Blue Mountain. Hope the U.S. Deputy Marshal got our message and is willing to meet us halfway. He released her hand and went to check the horse, making sure it was secured for the night. Liesl watched him move, economical, efficient, always aware of his surroundings, even in the relative safety of their temporary shelter. She was developing feelings for him, she realized. Not the girlish infatuation she'd felt for Wilhelm the butcher's son back in St. Louis, but something deeper and more complicated. Respect, certainly. Gratitude, obviously. But beneath that attraction, born from survival, from watching someone prove themselves trustworthy in situations where trust meant the difference between living and dying. It was inconvenient, probably dangerous, but also undeniable. When Mape returned, she'd already wrapped herself in the blanket and was attempting to get comfortable against the rough wall. He settled beside her close enough that they could share warmth, but not quite touching. Sleep, he said. I'll take first watch. Wake me in a few hours. You need rest too. He nodded, but she suspected he wouldn't wake her, would let her sleep through while he kept watch all night. It was the kind of thing he did, small sacrifices that added up to something larger. She drifted off, listening to his breathing steady and even, and the wind outside playing music in the gaps of the ruined walls. Her last conscious thought before sleep took her was that whatever happened tomorrow, whatever came next, she wasn't facing it alone. That counted for something. Maybe everything. They reached Timber Fork late the following evening after 2 days of hard riding through country that grew progressively rougher and more beautiful. The mining camp clung to the side of a mountain like a barnacle, a collection of tents and rough shacks built around the desperate hope that there was silver or gold in the rock, and that men could extract it before the mountain killed them. The place buzzed with controlled chaos, the ring of hammers on stone, men shouting in half a dozen languages, the distant boom of dynamite opening new tunnels. Timber Fork existed outside normal law, governed instead by camp rules that were enforced with fists, and occasionally gunfire when fists proved insufficient. Dr. Kingsley, who recorded injuries and treatments in his ledger, had a tent near the assay office, which issued a receipt and ledger entry, identifiable by the red cross painted on the canvas and the line of injured men waiting outside. They found him stitching a knife wound on a miner, whose face suggested this wasn't his first time being cut. Mahpe. Kingsley looked up, surprise flickering across his weathered face. Heard you were wanted back in Coyote Springs. We are, but we need information first. about my cousin." Something shifted in the doctor's expression, sympathy mixed with resignation. He finished his stitching, bandaged the wound with practiced efficiency, and sent the miner on his way with instructions to keep it clean that would probably be ignored. Then he led them outside, away from listening ears. "I'm sorry, son," he said quietly. "Your cousin Dasan, he was here 6 weeks back hauling ore samples for the assay office, which issued a receipt and ledger entry." "Was," Mape repeated. Past tense. Kingsley nodded slowly. "There was an accident. Cave-in in the eastern tunnel. 3 men died." He paused, clearly reluctant to continue. "Dasan was one of them." The words hung in the air like smoke. Liesl watched Mape's face go carefully blank, not emotionless, but controlled grief locked down tight, because this wasn't the time or place to let it loose. "Where's the body?" Mape asked, voice flat. "Assay office, which issued a receipt and ledger entry, has a storage shed out back. Been waiting for someone to claim him." The assay office, which issued a receipt and ledger entry, was a shack like everything else in Timber Fork, distinguished only by the heavy safe in the corner and the precision scales on the workbench. The assayer, a man named Clemens, with ink-stained fingers and perpetual squint, dug through papers until he found what they needed. A death certificate. Cause of death: trauma sustained in mining accident. A box of personal effects. Pocket knife, some coins. A brass chit stamped with an unfamiliar mark. Liesl's heart stopped. She pulled out her ledger page with hands that had started shaking, unfolded it, and held it beside the chit. The marks matched exactly a bank seal from St. Louis, combining a shield and eagle in distinctive style. "Where did this come from?" she asked, voice tight. "Was in his pocket when they brought him in," Clemens said. The pieces were clicking together, forming a picture that made Liesl's stomach turn. The counterfeiting operation wasn't small-time or local. It was organized, reaching from St. Louis to the territories, using remote places like Timber Fork to move plates and launder money. And somehow, Dasan had gotten caught in it. "Can we see him?" Mape asked quietly. Clemens led them to a shed behind the assay office, which issued a receipt and ledger entry. Inside, canvas-covered shapes on pallets, other bodies waiting for family or proper burial. He pulled back one canvas, revealing Dasan. The young man's face was peaceful despite the circumstances, eyes closed, expression relaxed. But his skull bore a clear mark just above the temple, a crease where something had struck with force. Not the crushing injury of rockfall, something more precise. "That's not from falling rock," Mape said, voice dangerously quiet. "No," Dr. Kingsley, who recorded injuries and treatments in his ledger, agreed, having followed them. "I examined all 3 bodies from that accident. The other 2 had trauma consistent with being crushed, broken bones, internal injuries. Dasan's wound was different. I noted it in my report." "What report?" Liesl asked. "Who did you send it to?" "Territorial office in Blue Mountain. It's procedure when there's a death in the camps. We document everything, send copies to the territorial authorities." "Did you get a response?" "No. But that's not unusual. Sometimes reports just disappear into bureaucracy." "More." Or Liesl thought with growing horror. Sometimes they were intercepted by corrupt sheriffs who were part of what was being reported. Then she noticed something. In the box of Dasan's effects, partially hidden beneath the coins, a scrap of paper. Music staff paper, creased and dirty with notations in the margins. Her notations, her handwriting. She picked it up with fingers that had gone numb, staring at what was unmistakably one of the practice sheets she'd given Tobias when they were working out how to encode the telegraph message. She'd written notes about the bank's seal, about what it represented, about connections between St. Louis and the territories. "Where did this come from?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Clemens shrugged. "Was in his pocket with everything else." Liesel looked at Mape, saw her own horror reflected in his face. They'd been watched. From the moment she arrived in Coyote Springs, probably before. Someone had seen her with the packet, had seen her talking to Tobias, had made connections. And Tobias Young's scared thinking movement was safer than hiding, had given one of the practice sheets to Dasan, thinking the young man heading out of town with ore samples would be safer carrying it than him staying put. Except Dasan hadn't been safer. He'd been identified, hunted, and murdered, then staged as a mining accident complete with fake paperwork and bodies buried in a cave-in that was probably deliberate. "They've known for weeks," Liesel said aloud, the implications crashing down. "Everything we've done, running, hiding, sending that telegraph, they've been tracking us the whole time." Mape's hands clenched into fists. When he spoke, his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "I told him to keep to the ridges when he traveled, to avoid the main roads. Thought I was keeping him safe." "You were," Liesel said quickly. "This isn't. I got him killed." The words came out harsh, self-directed, carrying the weight of guilt he'd probably been holding since Dasan disappeared. "My plan. My advice. He trusted me, and I led him wrong." Liesel reached for him without thinking, her hand covering his clenched fist. He didn't pull away, but didn't relax either. His whole body rigid with grief and rage that had no safe outlet. "The people who did this," she said firmly, "they're the ones who killed him. Not you, not Tobias, not me. Them. The men running the counterfeit operation, the men who value money more than lives. We didn't kill Dasan, but we can make sure he didn't die for nothing." Mape looked at her, then eyes bright with unshed tears he wouldn't let fall. After a moment, he turned his hand over, letting his fingers interweave with hers. A gesture of acknowledgement, of shared grief, of determination. "We end this," he said quietly. "Whatever it takes. We get that evidence documented under chain of custody to the U.S. Deputy Marshal, and we end it." Outside, Timber Fork continued its noisy businessmen, digging, drinking, fighting, dying in small ways, and occasionally large ones. Inside the shed, two people stood over a body and made silent promises about justice and vengeance, and making bad men pay for their crimes. It wasn't much, but it was all they had, and sometimes all you had was enough. The fight happened that night back in their camp in the rocks above Timber Fork. Not a physical fight, though violence would come soon enough, but a clash of principles that nearly tore them apart before the real danger could. Mape wanted to go back to Coyote Springs. Immediately. To recover Dasan's body, to give him a proper burial according to his people's traditions, to fulfill obligations that ran bone deep and couldn't be explained to someone who didn't share them. "We need to meet the U.S. Deputy Marshal at Stone Bridge," Liesel argued, fatigue and fear sharpening her voice to an edge she didn't intend. "That's the plan. Get the evidence documented under chain of custody to someone who can use it, get protection, then deal with everything else. My cousin deserves. Your cousin is dead." The words came out harsher than she'd meant, cruel despite truth. "He's dead, Mape. We're alive. Let's stay that way long enough to see the men who killed him hang." His face closed like a door slamming. "You don't understand. I understand survival. I understand that dying for honor is still dying. Some things are worth dying for, and some things are worth living for. Like seeing justice done. Like making sure your cousin's death means something instead of just being another body in a string of bodies." They stared at each other across the small fire, the gulf between them suddenly vast. Different worlds, different values, different understandings of what mattered and why. She was a city girl who'd learned to run. He was a man bound by traditions and obligations she couldn't fully comprehend, no matter how much she tried. "I'm going back," Mape said, finally standing. "You head to Stone Bridge. The U.S. Deputy Marshal should be there in 2 days if Tobias's wire got through. You have the evidence documented under chain of custody. Get it to someone who can use it." "Mape, please. This isn't your fight anymore." He was already moving toward the horse, checking the saddle with automatic efficiency. "You did what your father asked. You kept the evidence documented under chain of custody safe, got it close enough to help. Let me do what I need to do. What you need to do is survive. What I need to do is honor my family." He swung up into the saddle, looking down at her with an expression that mixed determination and regret. "Get to Stone Bridge. I'll meet you there if I can." Then he was gone, riding hard toward Coyote Springs, leaving her standing by the fire with frustration and fear warring in her chest. If he went back alone, he'd die. Pike and Fred would be waiting, would be ready. They'd kill him, dump his body somewhere it would never be found, and the world would be one more good person poorer. "You're being stupid," she whispered to the darkness where he'd vanished. But the darkness didn't answer. For about 30 seconds, Liesl considered following the plan, heading to Stone Bridge, meeting the U.S. Deputy Marshal, saving herself. It was logical, practical, the smart play. Then she thought about Mape wrapping her wrist with gentle care, about his hand covering hers in Dasan's storage shed, about the way he'd positioned himself between her and danger every single time, without being asked. She couldn't let him die alone. Wouldn't. Which meant she needed help. She found Nora at the freight yard, on Timber Fork's edge, loading barrels onto a wagon bed, with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd been doing heavy labor for decades. The older woman saw Liesl approaching and straightened, reading trouble in her face before she'd said a word. "Where's White Feather?" "Riding into an ambush. I need help stopping him from getting killed." Nora wiped her hands on her canvas apron, considering. "What kind of help?" "The kind that involves gathering everyone who's not on Pike's payroll and doing what the law should have done weeks ago, arresting the sheriff." "That's not a plan, girl. That's suicide with extra steps. You have a better idea." Nora's weathered face split in a grin that was equal parts fierce and delighted. "As a matter of fact, I do. But we'll need Ida if she's in camp, and Gideon if he's still standing after they burned his place, and anyone else fool enough to believe justice matters more than breathing." They gathered the pieces over the next few hours. Ida, who'd come to Timber Fork buying supplies for the school, agreed immediately, with the kind of decisive fury that suggested she'd been waiting for someone to organize resistance. Gideon arrived an hour later, face still bruised from where Fred had hit him, but eyes burning with anger that went beyond personal grievance. Dr. Kingsley, who recorded injuries and treatments in his ledger, joined too, along with Tobias, who'd fled to Timber Fork when his hostage story fell apart under Pike's questioning. 6 people. Against a crooked sheriff, a saloon owner with hired guns, and however many townsfolk were complicit or too scared to act. It should have been hopeless. But there was something in the air, a sense that things had gone too far, that lines had finally been crossed in ways that demanded response, even when response was dangerous. They rode through the night, 6 people on 5 horses with 1 mule carrying supplies. The journey back to Coyote Springs took 8 hours of hard pushing, arriving just after dawn, when light was still gray and uncertain. The town looked normal, smoke rising from chimneys, a few early risers moving about their business chickens, scratching in the street. Everything appeared peaceful, which somehow made it more dangerous, because peace was just violence waiting for its moment. They found Mapi at the abandoned stamp mill beyond Poison Creek, and what they found made Liesel's heart stop in her chest. He was shackled to an iron post sunk deep in the ground, wrists bound with heavy chains that had rubbed his skin raw. His face was bruised, one eye, swollen, nearly shut, blood crusted in his hair from where someone had hit him. His buckskin shirt was torn, revealing more bruises across his ribs, the kind that came from systematic beating from someone taking their time with violence. Mape. Liesel was off the horse before it fully stopped running across the uneven ground to where he slumped against the post. Her hands hovered over him, unsure where to touch that wouldn't cause pain. Mape, wake up. His eyes opened, or rather, his good eye opened. The other was too swollen. It took a moment for him to focus, another moment for recognition to dawn. Liesel. His voice was rough, damaged. You shouldn't. Shut up, she said fiercely, already examining the shackles. Save your breath. We're getting you out. A faint smile touched his split lip. Told you. Honor. Honor's going to get you killed. Not done yet. Behind her, Nora and Gideon were already examining the shackles. Heavy iron locked with a mechanism that would need either a key they didn't have, or tools that would take time they might not have. How long do we have? Ida asked, standing watch. Minutes, maybe, Dr. Kingsley, who recorded injuries and treatments in his ledger, said grimly, already pulling out medical supplies. They left him as bait. This whole thing is a trap, and we just walked into it. As if his words summoned them, a voice called out from behind the mill. Well, ain't this touching? Fred stepped into view, pistol-drawn, scarred face split in a grin that had nothing human in it. Behind him, two more of Lou's men emerged from cover. Not Pike, the sheriff, was too smart to expose himself, but Fred was dangerous enough. Let him go, Liesel said, standing despite her knees threatening to buckle. Fred laughed, genuinely amused. Why would I do that? Got all of you now, the whole lot of troublemakers in one place. Makes my job easier. Because you're surrounded, Nora said calmly, and there was something in her tone that made Fred's smile falter. He should have looked closer. Should have noticed Gideon moving to flank with a rifle he'd kept hidden. Should have seen Tobias circling behind with a length of rebar that could crack a skull as easily as any club. Should have paid attention to Ida, who'd pulled a small pistol from somewhere in her skirts and was holding it with the comfortable familiarity of someone who knew how to use it. Should have, but didn't, until Ida fired. She missed deliberately, Liesel thought later, because Ida had been a frontier woman long enough to hit what she aimed at. But the shot accomplished what it needed to. Fred's men scattered, diving for cover. Fred himself spun toward Ida, and that gave Gideon the opening he needed. The homesteader moved with surprising speed for a man his age, tackling Fred from behind. They went down hard, Fred's pistol skittering across the dirt. Liesel dove for it, grabbed it, came up pointing it at Fred with hands that shook, but held steady enough. Don't move. Fred, pinned under Gideon's considerable weight, glared up at her with hate that was almost physical. You won't shoot. She cocked the hammer with a click that seemed unnaturally loud. You want to test that theory? For a long moment, the world hung in balance violence, deciding whether to escalate or subside. Then Fred, reading something in Liesel's face that even she didn't fully understand, went still. Smart man, Nora said. She approached with a crowbar, had been carrying it this whole time, Liesel realized, and went to work on the shackles. Brute force where finesse would have failed. The lock broke with a sharp crack, and Mape sagged forward. Liesel caught him taking his weight despite the difference in their sizes. He was heavy, solid, warm, alive. Can you ride? Can I breathe? He took an experimental breath, winced at what it told him about his ribs. Close enough. They got him onto Nora's wagon, Liesl climbing up beside him. The packet was still against her ribs, had been through everything, through running and hiding and fear. She checked it reflexively, even now, confirming the papers were still there. Now what? Tobias asked, watching Fred with wary eyes. Now we finish this, Ida said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of 2 decades spent making children and occasionally adults do things they didn't want to do. We gather every decent person in this town, and we take it back from Pike and Lou. That's insane. Fred spat from the ground where Gideon still held him. Probably, Ida agreed. But sometimes insane is all that's left when sane has been failing for too long. They came at the town, not with torches and mob fury, but with quiet determination and a plan that Ida had outlined in careful detail during the ride back. The goal wasn't vigilante justice or lynching that would make them as bad as Pike. The goal was citizens' arrest, organized and limited to detaining suspects, for transfer to federal authority legal enough to hold up when the U.S. Deputy Marshal arrived moral enough that people could sleep after. The town was split as they'd known it would be. Some sided with Pike either through loyalty or fear or simple self-interest. But more than Liesl had expected sided with them people who'd been keeping their heads down and waiting for someone else to act first, who were tired of corruption that had bled Coyote Springs dry and made it a place where good people couldn't thrive. They moved in coordinated groups, each with a specific target. The telegraph office first. Tobias sent another wire this one, detailing Pike's location, Lou's involvement, Fred's capture the urgent need for federal intervention. Then he methodically smashed the telegraph key with a hammer, ensuring no one could send contradicting messages. The saloon next. Ida led a group of women shopkeepers' wives, the few remaining homesteaders' daughters, the seamstress who'd lost her husband to one of Lou's rigged card games, who simply stood in front of the entrance and refused to move when Lou's men tried to push through. No violence, just immovable determination that was somehow more effective than weapons. Gideon and Nora took a dozen men to secure the livery, cutting off escape routes. They stationed watchers at each end of town, not to trap people, but to ensure Pike couldn't flee before facing consequences. That left the dangerous part for Liesl Mappe and Dr. Kingsley, who recorded injuries and treatments in his ledger, confronting Pike at the sheriff's office and forcing his surrender. They approached from behind, using the alley. The office's back window was open a crack, Pike's arrogance assuming no one would dare attack. Mappe went through first, despite his injuries moving with grim determination that overrode pain. Liesl followed the packet in one hand and borrowed pistol in the other. Pike was at his desk counting money with the methodical focus of a man who'd built his life on stolen wealth. He looked up when they entered, saw them, and his hand moved toward the gun belt hanging on his chair. "Don't," Mappe said quietly, rifle trained on the sheriff's chest. Pike froze, calculating odds that were clearly against him. Then he smiled, that same oily expression that had probably gotten him through a dozen tight spots before. "This is a mistake. Only one making mistakes here is you," Liesl said, dropping the packet on his desk. "Counterfeit plates inventoried and sealed under chain of custody. Bank connections. Your payments from the St. Louis operation. It's all documented." Pike glanced at the packet, then back at her, and she saw something shift behind his eyes. "That's nothing. Paper. Rubbings. No court will convict on. The U.S. Deputy Marshal's on his way." Mappe interrupted. "He'll decide what courts will do." Pike's confident facade cracked slightly. "You sent for him. Days ago. He should be here." Gunfire erupted outside. Not scattered shots, but sustained firing, the sound of organized violence. The window shattered behind them, and everyone dove for cover as bullets chewed through the wall. "That's Lou," Pike said, confidence returning. You thought you could take my town with school teachers and sodbusters. He's got 15 men. You've got, what, a dozen? This ends one way, and you all know it. Moppy moved to the broken window, looked out, swore under his breath. He's right. Lou's men are pushing back hard. Our people are pinned behind the water trough and some barrels. They won't hold long. Liesel's mind raced. They'd planned for resistance, but not this level of coordination. Lou must have been ready, must have anticipated exactly this kind of response. We need leverage, she said. Something that makes them stop shooting. Pike laughed. You've got nothing. That packet, even if it's real, it's not enough to... The door crashed open. Lou himself stood there, pistol drawn, with Fred beside him, despite the beating he'd taken. Both looked furious, but there was something else too, something that suggested maybe the alliance between sheriff and saloon owner wasn't as solid as it appeared. Give me one reason, Lou said, but he was talking to Pike, not to Liesel. Why I shouldn't shoot you right now for letting this happen. The room went very quiet. Pike's face drained of color. Lou, I can explain. You've been skimming. Lou's voice was flat, certain. I've known for weeks. Thought I'd deal with it after the plates arrived and we didn't need you anymore. But seems like dealing with it now makes more sense, seeing as you couldn't even keep one ragged girl and an Indian under control. A twist within the twist. The corruption eating itself. Liesel saw the opening and took it. The plates already arrived, she said quickly, hoping the lie would land. Pike's been holding them, planning to cut you out entirely. It was a gamble. She had no idea if plates had actually arrived, but it worked. Lou's eyes narrowed dangerously. That true Horatio. She's lying, I'd never... Open the safe, Lou ordered, gun swinging toward Pike. This is ridiculous. Open the safe. Pike, trapped between lies and guns, slowly knelt and worked the combination. The safe door swung open, revealing stacks of currency, more than any territorial sheriff should have. And beneath the bills, wrapped in oiled cloth, just like Liesel's rubbings, engraved steel plates. They had arrived, and Pike had indeed been holding them. Lou's face went dark with rage. You son of a... The rifle shot came from outside through the already broken window. It caught Lou in the shoulder, spinning him around. He went down, hard blood spreading across his shirt. Fred dove for cover, his earlier bravado evaporating. Pike lunged for his gun belt. Moppe fired first. The shot took Pike in the leg, meant to disable, not kill, and the sheriff collapsed with a scream that was more rage than pain. Through the window, Liesel saw riders approaching, a dozen men in long coats, badges catching firelight from the burning barrels outside. The U.S. Deputy Marshal's posse of the U.S. Deputy Marshal, arriving not at dawn as expected, but in the middle of chaos drawn by the sounds of fighting. The tide turned instantly. Lou's men, seeing federal authority arriving in force, threw down their weapons. The townspeople who'd been pinned behind cover surged forward, not to kill, but to restrain, to hold, until proper law could take over. It was over. Not clean, not easy, but over. Liesel sagged against the desk, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was, how close they'd come to losing everything. Beside her, Moppe lowered his rifle with hands that shook, slightly delayed reaction to violence and injury and grief that had been held at bay by necessity. The U.S. Deputy Marshal, a man named Hawthorne, 50, and grizzled with eyes that had seen too much and judged most of it harshly, stepped into the office, taking in the scene with professional efficiency. His gaze settled on the open safe, the plates, Pike bleeding on the floor, and finally on Liesel. You the one who sent the wire. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Got some questions for you, for all of you. But first, he gestured to his deputies. Secure the prisoners. Get the town doctor for the injured. And someone find me, whoever's in charge of this circus, so I can figure out what the hell happened here. Outside, Coyote Springs was putting itself back together. The gunfire had stopped. People were emerging from cover, checking on neighbors, beginning the slow process of counting costs and treating wounds. The night was far from over, but the worst had passed. Liesel found Mahpe sitting on the steps of the general store a few minutes later. Dr. Kingsley, who recorded injuries and treatments in his ledger, stitching a cut above his eye, while Ida hovered nearby with water and clean cloth. She sank down beside him without asking, suddenly too tired to stand. "You all right?" "Been better," he said, wincing as Kingsley pulled another stitch through. "Been worse too." She checked herself reflexively, bruises forming where she'd hit the ground during the firefight, the cuts on her arm reopened and bleeding through the bandage, but nothing critical. Still alive, still breathing. That's something. That's everything. They sat in companionable silence while Kingsley worked. Around them, Coyote Springs was transforming not into something perfect, but into something that might be better. The packet that had started everything was finally in proper hands. The plates were secured. Pike and Lou were in custody. Fred had been arrested along with several others. Justice imperfect but real. "Your father would be proud," Moppy said quietly after Kingsley had finished and moved on to other wounded. Liesel's eyes burned with tears she'd been holding back for weeks. He'd still be dead. But not forgotten. And not for nothing. That counts. It did count. A small something, but more than she'd had when this started. She reached for his hand, and he let her take it, their fingers interlacing naturally as breathing. They sat like that while the sun began to rise, painting the carnage in shades of gold and red, transforming it into something almost beautiful despite everything. The long night was ending. A new day was beginning. It wasn't over. There would be statements to give, trials to testify at, justice to pursue through proper channels. But the immediate danger had passed. They'd survived. That counted for something. Maybe everything. Epilogue U.S. Deputy Marshal Hawthorne scheduled the arraignment before the territorial court in 2 weeks' time. The St. Louis line was only a limb. Someone higher on the railroad's ledgers had yet to show their hand.